first hit death row, I felt so down and out. It's hurt when you have to suffer for something you didn't do.
October 25th, 1976. The 7 children of James Richardson were poisoned with a highly toxic synthetic compound called parathion. 6 of them died that day, while the last one passed away 24 hours later. The day before the incident, Richardson's wife, Annie Mae Richardson, prepared a lunch of beans, rice, and grits for the children. The meal was placed in a locked fridge in their Arizona home overnight. Then in the morning, James and his wife left to work at a farm, while they called a friendly neighbor, Bessie Reese, to babysit the kids. The oldest of the 4 took their lunch to school, while the remaining 3 sat at home with their good old neighbor Bessie. However, after having the lunch in school, Richardson's kids would begin convulsing and acting strange, along with the 3 back home. The school informed Richardson to come check on his kids at the clinic, but by the time he and his wife got there, 6 children were already dead. An autopsy was conducted. After the autopsy, it was discovered that the lunch was poisoned. Now in this situation, who would you hold responsible? Richardson, his wife, or the neighbor? Keep that answer in your head because this story's about to take a dramatic twist. 2 detectives went down to the Richardsons' home, investigating the source of that poison. They searched everywhere 5 times over, not finding anything. The next day, by the time the 7th child was confirmed dead, these same detectives went back to the residence, but this time they took more men with them. After a short while, they found a bag of parathion barely hidden in a corner. The bag wasn't there the previous day, so it's obvious that whoever kept that bag there was definitely responsible for the mass murder. And out of all the suspects, Richardson was charged with first-degree murder, all because he made a phone call the night before the incident, inquiring about life insurance for his kids. Now, there is no evidence showing that he poisoned them, so he wasn't charged with murder, but rather with child neglect. In 1968, after standing trial for many years, Richardson was finally sentenced to life with the possibility of parole. Apart from the phone call, there was nothing that proved this man guilty. On top of that, their neighbor, Bessie Reese, completely lying about being in the house that day, was the one who served the meal to the children, and was also on parole for killing her husband with poison. How did they overlook all of this and hold Richardson responsible? 1988. Reese was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, leading to her confession of the murders. The following year, Richardson was released after spending 21 years in prison. But upon that release, this man was already dead inside. He had multiple heart problems in prison. His wife divorced him, and he was broke with no job. In conclusion, he was left empty. Now, he was awarded a total compensation of just $1.2 million, which hasn't been paid in full as of today. That's a sad story, but not as sad as what the next convict had to go through to get exonerated. Number 9. John Bunn.
Y'all convicted and had a warm man in prison.
I want to say thank you, Your Honor, because it's been 27 years I've been fighting for my life.
That man right there is John Bunn, wrongly convicted for a 1991 murder. August 14th, 1991. 2 Rikers Island correction officers were shot dead during a robbery in Brooklyn, New York. One of them died, while the surviving officer, Robert Crossan, stated that the shooters were light-skinned African-American men in their 20s. John Bunn's an African-American, alright. That's the only description of Crossan's that he fit into. Yet, he was arrested for both robbery and murder. The day after the incident, an incredibly corrupt NYPD detective named Louis Scarcella claimed he received an anonymous tip that Bunn was the perpetrator of the act. So he went to Bunn's home, took him down to the station for questioning, and placed him in handcuffs like any other criminal in the precinct. Keep in mind that Bunn was just 14 years old at the time. Scarcella blatantly crossed the lines of his profession just to get Bunn locked up. There was no physical evidence, no forensic evidence, and no handwritten confession to prove his involvement in the crime. Yet in November 1992, Bunn was found guilty of both robbery and murder, with a sentence of 20 years to life in prison. Now in 2006, Bunn was granted parole after he saved a counselor from assault and rape from other inmates. A life on parole was just as bad as being incarcerated. He couldn't get a job, with the stigma of being a convict sticking with him. He fought to clear his name entirely from the record, and he did, after new findings proved that he was never at the scene of the crime, let alone committing it. May 18th. After 27 years of wrongful conviction, John Bunn was exonerated from all charges. After the judge announced him a free man, Bunn, in a really touching moment, addressed the court. He also had this wholesome moment with the judge where he couldn't control his tears and happiness. Now, Bunn's looking to help other wrongfully convicted African Americans like himself get the justice they deserve. Believe it or not, the next innocent convict on the list was implicated by the same detective who had falsely accused Bunn. Number 8. David Ranta.
I'm overwhelmed. It's interesting, and I would just like to say thank each and every one of you for supporting me today on this. As I said from the beginning, I had nothing to do with this case.
So that's David Ranta, on his way out of court after serving 22 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. February 8th, 1990. A Hasidic rabbi, Jaskol Wurzberger, was shot dead in his car while a jewelry robbery took place across the street. The robber then used his wagon as a getaway car from the police. Unknown to the murderer, Mr. Wurzberger was a Holocaust survivor and a respectable leader of the Satmar community in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, New York. Thousands attended the rabbi's funeral, and as I said earlier on, NYPD detective Louis Scarcella pulled Ranta into the murder case without having any evidence backing up his reasons. The only substantial reason why Ranta was convicted of that murder is because an eyewitness pointed to the fact that the criminal had a big nose. Now, when you hear that, it's disgusting how unprofessional this detective was. However, it didn't stop even the court from seeing the fact that they were sending an innocent man to jail for a crime he just didn't commit, without any physical evidence. Again, no DNA evidence, and certainly without a legitimate confession. David Ranta was sentenced to 23 years to life. But about 6 years after his conviction, 2 eyewitnesses who had testified against him revealed openly that they had lied. This was added to the fact that a number of other convictions and arrests by Detective Scarcella began gaining notoriety for being suspicious. The worst part of this case was that the detective actually knew the real killer. Yeah, he did. It was a notorious armed robber named Joseph Aston, who died in a car crash 2 months after he committed that murder. However, Scarcella never documented this information. The prosecutors dismissed it, and Ranta was kept in prison for 22 years, facing some of the most horrifying days of his life. In 1999, after Scarcella retired, a lot of new info came to light, and Ranta was exonerated. The judge who finally made it official expressed her deepest dissatisfaction for what Ranta had to go through.
Mr. Ranta, to say that I'm sorry for what you have endured would be an understatement and grossly inadequate.
But at that moment, nothing mattered to this man more than the fact that he was getting his freedom. He carried everything he owned in those 22 years over his shoulder, and in a cold voice, he said,
Thank you all. Thank you.
David Ranta was awarded $6.4 million in compensation from New York for what he went through, but I don't think any amount of money could erase the suffering he experienced. Number 7. Susan Melon.
I believe, based on what I've read, that she's innocent. And for that reason, I think the criminal justice system failed.
Conviction is overturned, and as to Ms. Melon, the case is dismissed.
1997. Susan Melon found herself in a dire situation after police apprehended her for the murder of her ex-lover, Richard Daley. She was taking her daughter Jessica to go grab some food at Mickey D's when the cops arrested her. During her interrogation, Susan kept expressing her innocence to the detectives, but they were convinced, even without any form of evidence, that she was responsible for this crime. They intimidated her that night, and she was later charged with first-degree murder. Now, during her trial, the prosecutors got a handful of witnesses claiming that she was responsible for the crime, and the court found her guilty. Subsequently, she was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. And just like any other innocent convicts incarcerated today, Susan was left to rot in jail for the rest of her life. Her only saving grace? She had a family, working tirelessly to prove her innocence. Her road to freedom began when the major witness in her case, June Patty, was later identified as a pathological liar, a drug addict, and one who had a history of falsifying info in the court of justice. Some of the detectives back then recruited her to corroborate any story she was told, while others say that she was just a troubled soul. Aside from that, further forensic evidence on the case showed that the victim, Richard Daley, was dead 3 hours before the prosecutors claimed Susan carried out the murder. Bailey was bludgeoned to death in an alley near his home, and his home was miles away from where the cops arrested Susan. Looking at it in retrospect, it's totally disturbing how this judge found her guilty in the first place. But on a second review of that case, Judge Mark Arnold discharged her conviction and set her free. From her reaction, Susan was more than happy to be out of prison. You can feel the smile and joy on her face as she reunited with her family.
I was in prison, but freedom wasn't in me. I always felt like I was free in the inside.
Is that your first cell phone?
Yeah, I never had one. I don't even know how to turn it on. I'm free!
Susan would be awarded $12 million in compensation by the state. Now, she can afford a comfortable life with her family. Number 6. Kirsten Labato.
So where'd you know?
Okay, well, we got some people shop you.
That was the happy moment Kirsten Labato walked on the street as a free woman, after being wrongfully convicted for 16 freaking years behind bars. May 2001, Kirsten Labato, then 18, began telling numerous friends in Las Vegas and her hometown of Panaca that a large black man tried to rape her at a hotel in Las Vegas. July 8, 2001, the mutilated corpse of a black man named Duran Bailey was found. Labato was charged with the crime more than 10 days later, after one of her friends informed police of her account of the sexual assault that supposedly occurred 2 months before. Obviously, Labato's sexual assault was orchestrated by another man, and she had nothing to do with the death of Bailey. During her interrogation, Labato confessed to stabbing the black man in his groin, pushing the police to take it as a confession to Mr. Bailey's murder. Now, this was a huge mix-up because there were 2 different black men involved here. Plus, Labato's house was nearly 200 miles away from the murder scene, and her family served as her alibi, stating the fact that she was home throughout that day. As usual, there was no physical evidence to prove her involvement, but still, a jury would find her guilty on first-degree murder, and she would be given 40 to 100 years in prison. But we know the story doesn't end there. After failing to secure her innocence in a second trial, her attorneys were able to prove that DNA samples, footprints, and pubic hair belonging to another individual were found at the murder scene. This would open up the floor for a third trial in 2017. It was so bizarre, almost feeling like the state of Nevada wanted to keep her locked up. The judge presiding over both her initial trials was asked to step down for passing judgment on such a baseless and ridiculous case. Finally, in January 2018, another judge stepped in, exonerating her of the conviction, setting Labato free.
I'm so overwhelmed and so happy and so grateful for all the people that have believed in me. You know what? I'd really like some coffee.
And like you just saw, she was ecstatic to be out. But the number of years she spent behind bars pales in comparison to this next innocent convict. Number 5. Ricky Jackson.
You know, words can't express how I feel right now. I'm just glad to be out, glad to be a free man.
What you just saw was Ricky finally walking out a free man after serving 39 years for a crime he didn't commit. May 19, 1975, businessman Harold Franks was killed outside a mall grocery store in Cleveland, Ohio. According to eyewitnesses, 3 African Americans perpetuated the act. 2 men beat him to a pulp and threw acid on his face, while the third man shot him twice with a handgun. They would also shoot the businessman's wife and flee the store in a green car, carrying along a briefcase of cash belonging to Harold Franks. The police would arrive on scene and grab 2 witnesses for questioning. One of them was Karen Smith. Now, Karen confirmed that the attack was orchestrated by 3 African Americans, but she claimed not to know them. The second eyewitness, 12-year-old Eddie Vernon, claimed the robbery and murder were committed by Ricky Jackson, Ronnie Bridgman, and Wiley Bridgman. Keep in mind that these 3 men did fit the description of the perpetrators, but they were completely innocent. With no murder weapon, no evidence of either man owning a green car, and with no atom of DNA match or physical evidence, Ricky, Ronnie, and Wiley were sentenced to death based on this 12-year-old's testimony in court. Just think about that for a second. Some say the boy was manipulated by the cops to give that testimony. Others say he was just too young and didn't know exactly what he saw. But at the end of the day, all 3 men were convicted, with Ricky being tagged the shooter. In 2003, Ronnie Bridgman was granted parole. His brother, on the other hand, was granted parole in 2002, but ran into difficulties because of his mental health, which he had suffered in prison. Then the big break in the case came when this 12-year-old boy, now 50, recanted his testimony. 2013, Vernon said a friend gave him the 3 names to present to the police and also claimed to be an eyewitness. But in reality, he wasn't even close to the crime scene and didn't see any boy. The next year, Vernon was asked to officially recant his statement, which he did. Then the process for Ricky's release was put into the works. In the following year, Ricky was officially released and his conviction was overturned. For all that time in prison, he was given by the wonderful state of Ohio $1 million in 2015. In 2016, he would receive an additional $2.65 million from the State Court of Claims, based on estimates of lost income. And finally, the city of Cleveland also agreed to pay a joint $18 million to be shared among all 3 men, in a bid for them to drop all pending lawsuits against the city. Ricky now holds the record for one of the longest sentences served before exoneration in the U.S. Does the money take away the pain? We don't think so. Number 4. Raymond Toler.
Yes. Yes.
No.
May 24th, 1981. 2 cousins, a boy and a girl, were coaxed into a wooded area at the Rocky River Reservation in Cleveland, Ohio. The boy would be assaulted and the girl would be raped. 3 weeks after the incident, 24-year-old Raymond Toler was identified as matching the description of the suspect when he was stopped by a park ranger during a routine traffic stop. Raymond was a musician in Ohio, but at the same time he earned a living working temporary jobs. He lived with his mother and his little sister. After an interrogation, he was convicted of rape, kidnapping, and felonious assault for both victims. He was sentenced to 12 years to life in prison for rape, with additional consecutive sentences of 7 to 25 years and 5 to 25 years. This man was condemned to die in his prison cell until something miraculous happened. In 2004, a judge granted an appeal from his attorneys for his DNA to be tested to prove his innocence. That rarely happened, but you could say it was Toler's lucky year. However, year after year, Toler never got any tangible feedback from that test. He became depressed at the fact that his life was about to be condemned within prison walls forever. November 5th, 2008. After 4 years of waiting and requesting numerous tests, Toler finally got feedback. According to that DNA result, the semen-stained underwear on one of the victims showed partial genetic profiles of 2 males, neither of them being Toler. And although he didn't match that DNA, the prosecutors weren't willing to let it go just like that. In a way you'd expect them to react. They claimed that the DNA doesn't prove anything, but for the court in general, it raised questions about how exactly evidence was obtained to convict Raymond Toler in the first place. Well, they must all have amnesia, because there was no evidence presented during his trial, and you'd expect them to hasten his release, but no. Instead, it would take them another 2 years before they could test that individual profile of semen found on the underwear, plainly exonerating Toler. May 5th, 2010, the charges against Toler were dropped, and he's expected to receive a whopping $1 million for all those years he spent in prison. Number 3. Daniel Villegas.
Verdict Form B. We, the jury, find the defendant Daniel Villegas not guilty of...
April 10th, 1993. There was a terrible incident. 4 teens were walking back from a high school party, and out of nowhere, someone shot at them. 2 of the boys, Armando Lazo and Bobby England, were hurt badly. Sadly, Bobby didn't make it, but Armando survived after members of a nearby residence helped him to the hospital. Daniel had no involvement in this crime, but like most of the cases in the 90s, cops were just eager to pin the shooting on anybody, and Villegas was an unfortunate target. Now, the police arrested Daniel when he was only 16 years old. He said that they made him confess to the crime, even though he didn't do it. He didn't even have a lawyer, and his parents weren't even there to help him. He was coerced into making a confession by the cops, and although he tried taking it back, prosecutors used that against him. Daniel had his first trial in 1994, but the jury couldn't come up with a decision, leading to a mistrial. Then the following year, he had another trial, and this time, the jury found him guilty of capital murder. He was subsequently sentenced to spend his life in prison. But in 2013, The court realized they made a mistake. They recanted the guilty verdict, and Daniel was set free about a year later. During that time, he got married and became a dad of 2 kids. But there was still one more trial, and if he was found guilty, that would have been a goodbye to his family and friends forever. In his 3rd trial, prosecutors didn't have DNA, forensic evidence, or even a gun, proving that Daniel did that crime. And because of that, the jury decided he was not guilty. Daniel cried tears of relief because he was finally declared innocent after spending 18 long years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Number 2, Michael Hanlin.
I was first incarcerated in 1978, and I've watched half my life go by behind bars. I always hoped this day would come, but I can't believe it's actually happening now.
November 1978. A biker and close friend of Michael Hanlin named JT McGarry disappeared from his home in Ventura County, California. JT's body was discovered a few days later. He'd been shot multiple times, and his body had been dumped on the side of a service road 28 miles from his house. As I said, JT and Hanlin were friends before his death, and as investigations went on, Hanlin was arrested and convicted as his murderer. Ever since, Hanlin had maintained his innocence despite the conviction. In 1999, a nonprofit organization called the California Innocence Project started reviewing hundreds of cases, and Michael was able to get in touch with them after 20 years in prison. They took an interest in his case and decided to help him. Over years of investigation, the CIP was able to uncover police reports that had been sealed before Michael's trial. The reports implicated others, not Michael, in the crime. Now, if that wasn't crazy enough, these reports impeached the prosecution's key witnesses. It turned out that a defense attorney and a known drug dealer named Bruce Robertson, who represented many of the prosecution's witnesses in other cases, made concerted efforts to steer the investigation away from his clients and toward Michael. Although Robertson is now dead, people claim he intimidated and threatened witnesses to testify against Michael Hanlin. This guy single-handedly manipulated the entire case to put Hanlin behind bars. Now, while you'd expect Hanlin to be released, what happened next was far from it. A judge from the district court denied Hanlin's release because most of the witnesses were dead by that time. So, there was really no way to justify the claims against Robertson. Now, whether that makes sense or not, the CIP got additional DNA testing that secured Hanlin's release. November 24, 2014, Hanlin was finally let out of the court a free man. He stepped out, took a good look at the sky, and made his way to a McDonald's outlet to get that first well-prepared burger in 36 years. What a guy. And number 1, Hubert Nathan Myers and Clifford Williams.
Mr. Williams and Mr. Myers, the indictments have been dismissed against you. You are free to go, and we are adjourned.
What's on there? May 2nd, 1976. A shooting occurred on Morgan Street in Jacksonville, Florida. Jeanette Williams and her partner, Nina Marshall, were asleep in bed when gunshots rang out in their bedroom. Jeanette was killed almost instantly, sustaining multiple bullet wounds. Her partner, Nina, was also shot many times, but was able to leave the house and travel to the hospital for care. Hearing the shots and commotion, neighbors and friends attending a birthday party came outside to observe this scene. 2 people who were in attendance were Nathan Myers and Clifford Williams. Despite their alibis of being at that party when the gunshots rang out, and also a fact confirmed by over 45 people, both of these men were arrested by police just hours after the shooting and charged with the crime. July 22, 1976, the state of Florida jointly trialed Nathan and Clifford for first-degree murder and attempted murder. Nina, who survived, identified Nathan and Clifford by name in court, confirming that they were the shooters, but it wasn't enough evidence. Given how concrete their alibis were, this resulted in the first trial ending in a mistrial. Now, months later, a second joint trial was held. At this wonderful trial, physical evidence from the crime scene was never presented to the jury. Evidence that would have contradicted Nina's testimony was also not presented, and none of Nathan nor Clifford's alibis were called to provide testimony in their defense. It was like their attorneys were selling them out. No, that statement's wrong. They actually sold them out because they were both handed a life sentence just 2 days into the trial. They appealed for years and maintained their innocence in prison. Luckily, new evidence in the case surfaced and showed that all the bullets fired from the crime came from a single gun, meaning there was only one shooter and not two. Further evidence also showed that the bullets came from outside and not inside, as Nina claimed. The whole case was a sham, and these men were exonerated after serving 42 years in prison. Nathan was 18 years old when he went in and 60 when he came out, while Clifford was 38 and he got out at 76. These two poor men were robbed of their lives, and so were the 9 others that we went over in this video. All it took was one corrupted attorney, a corrupted detective, a corrupted witness, and one piece of information to incarcerate these people who had absolutely nothing to do with the crime. And although they were exonerated, there are thousands more out there who have suffered, given up hope, and died in prison as innocent convicts. While these ones did survive, it does make you question our judicial system as a whole, and what percentage of the time is justice actually being served.
Justice, my friends, is a decision. Thank you very much.